Hello grade 9s, in this video I will be explaining the accounting cycle. It starts with a transaction where you buy things on cash or buy things cash or on credit, which means you pay later, or you sell things to customers for cash, or they buy on credit. Okay, so that when you're buying on credit, that's creditors control or creditors, and when you sell on credit, that's debtors. Okay, so we can buy assets or other things, we can sell assets or trading stock, etc. Okay, so we can also pay for expenses, and we receive capital or income. Okay, so that's a transaction. Then the transaction will then be written, or the transaction will then be used when we get a source document. Okay, when every transaction takes place, we get a source document like a receipt or invoice or check counterfoil. That's a slip that we use after a transaction took place. And this slip or source document we use to write transactions in the different journals, like the CPJ when it's cash payments, CRJ when it's cash receipts, and the CJ when we buy on credit, and the CAJ when we give an allowance or get an allowance from a supplier or creditor. Okay, so that's the journals. Then from the journals we write these transactions. We summarize all the journals in the general ledger or T accounts, and each individual account, for example stationery, bank, creditors control, will be summarized from all the journals. So there will be transactions from different journals, which the final or summarized total will go into the general ledger to the specific account. Okay, so all the transactions in the CPJ, CRJ, etc. that has to do with stationery will be written in the stationery T account. The same with bank, which is only the CRJ and the CPJ will go into the bank account. And when it is a creditors control account, we've got three journals, the CPJ, the CJ and the CAJ, that we write transactions in the creditors control account. Okay, let's say the closing balance for the creditors control account is 11,500. That means that we owe all creditors 11,500. Okay, so we've got the journals, which goes to the general ledger, but it also goes to the creditors ledger. Now the creditors ledger, there's three different journals, as I said earlier, the CPJ, the CJ and the CAJ. Now if we buy on credit, it increases the liability or the amount that we owe to the creditor. If we pay the creditor in the CPJ, it decreases the amount that we owe the creditor. And if we also write a transaction where we get an allowance in the, or a discount in the CAJ, creditors allowances journal, we also decrease the amount that we owe to the creditors. Okay, but these specific journals, we will look for the name of a specific creditor. Okay, and then we're going to write it in the creditors ledgers. Let's say, for example, I want to do Mr. Johnson's account, where you transacted with Mr. Johnson. So I want to see all the transactions that comes from these three journals where I did business with Mr. Johnson. So I'm going to look for Mr. Johnson's name in these three journals. Okay, and then I will write it in the creditors ledger. So in the end I can see I bought from Mr. Johnson, I paid Mr. Johnson, or I got some discount from Mr. Johnson. Okay, at the end of the creditors ledger per creditor, I will get a final balance. So let's say I did a few transactions with Mr. Johnson. At the end of the month I owe Mr. Johnson 500 Rand. So that 500 Rand will then go to Mr. Johnson's name in the creditors list. The creditors list is literally showing you've got creditors, who will be the creditors and how much do you owe each individual one of them. So let's say I owed Macro as well, so I had a lot of transactions with Macro, and the final total that I owe Macro is 10,000 Rand. And Mrs. Vincent, so if I add the three together, I owe 11,500 to creditors. So that's all the creditors, and these are the individual accounts. Because if I go to Mr. Johnson and I want to pay his account, and I want to pay everything, I need to know how much do I owe Mr. Johnson. Then this 11,500 of the list must then be equal to the final balance of the creditors control, because that is all the creditors. We don't specify here which creditors. That is only specified within the creditors ledger and the creditors list. So the creditors ledger has accounts for Mr. Johnson, all the transactions, accounts for Macro, all the transactions, and accounts for Mrs. Vincent, all the transactions. And then at the end, the creditors list, we only take the final total from the creditors ledger and we put it in the specific list, and therefore we owe 11,500 to all creditors. Okay, so that's just a shortened version of the accounting cycle for what we have done so far this year.